Bismillah, walhamdulillah, wa salatu wa salam ala rasulillah. In this session, we want to reflect on the history of Dawah in the US. First of all, we know that Dawah in the US was engaged in by a number of different communities and groups, so that historically there has been a variety of Dawah efforts, some coming close to the Quran and the Sunnah, and others far from the Quran and the Sunnah, but still contributing to the climate of Muslims in the community of Islam in the West, in particular in the US. So there has been a qualitative difference in the Dawah efforts that have been undertaken in the US, so that we find a number of groups and they will hold different beliefs and at times contradict even the teachings of Islam while still claiming to do a service to Islam. The unique reality here is this, that many of these groups initially that were doing da'wah and held beliefs that were contrary to Islam were the portals and the conduits by which many people began to take Shahada later on. So we see the Ahmadiyya movement and we see groups like the Nation of Islam have an instrumental role early on in doing da'wah and helping people to come into Islam. So we have to understand that there's a qualitative difference between these groups, and we have to understand how they influence the landscape. To separate in the name of orthodoxy the history of those groups from the present reality now, I believe is a mistake. Because what happens is that we begin not to understand why we're in the condition that we're in today, and why is it that certain things became acceptable, certain things became apparent, certain things became dominant. These various groups eventually emerged into other forces and groups that had a diversity of aims. So then we begin also to see in the landscape groups like MSA, then eventually like Ikna and Isna, and then now today we see what we see, like Al Maghrib Institute, Zaytun, and so on and so forth. It took a while to get to this point, but the understanding of the community has never been homogeneous, meaning similar in thought, similar in quality, with the same aims, informed by the same sources, informed by the same values. So the Dawah efforts in the US have, for the most part, always been diverse in aims, even those that drew directly from the Quran and the Sunnah, or those who were attached to Muslim scholarship from the Muslim world. They always had diversity of aims. Now we're beginning to see this concept of long-term insight, thinking about the future of the Muslim community. But for the most part, many of the groups that were aligned with the values of the Quran and the Sunnah, and allied with the concept of Tawheed, either in a philosophical sense or in an athari sense, didn't really have long-term vision about how to build the community. And this is why we can find that a masjid will manifest, will become dominant, will grow in an environment in which there was no thought about parking, or there was no thought about a youth area, or there was no thought about where the sisters should be. Masjid is a house, storefront, because they were dealing with the moment. It wasn't established with a plan of building a community in the future. It wasn't based on an idea that was planned out according to a schemata that will govern the way the community will unfold. Most communities, even those that have architectural plans before being based, still in their programming, in their governance of the community, are not thinking about the long term, right? Not thinking about the long term. And this is why it's important to understand the way the history, that the way that the history of Islam uh, in this community of Muslims in the West, in the U.S. in particular, has unfolded, so that we look to the past and we understand how some problems emerged, right? Up to now, we still struggle with the way that we should govern a masjid, uh, given that our masajid are non-profit organizations. There's an obligation to govern them under the rules of a 501c3, but we still don't understand the flexibility and the parameters of a 501c3 idea for a religious organization, tax exempt nonprofit status, and then how to relate that to an Islamic identity or an Islamic set of values. We're still trying to understand that. We're still trying to understand what it means to have a board. We're still trying to understand the concept of voting in the masjid, voting a person into office or out of office. We have confusion about this issue, the issue of voting as a construct overall, not just in the issue of a masjid or in relation to a masjid, but as a Muslim community living in a democratic or a society that votes. You know, this is a concept for us which is kind of alien and strange. But in any event, the argument that is being made here is that it's important to understand the history of the Muslim community. It's important to understand the history of the Muslim community and how Islam was called to, and how it is that institutions began to emerge to support the practice of Islam, right? How it is that now we try to support the practice of Islam. What are we doing to support the practice of Islam, right? And so many of the communities in the past, even when we look at the influence of the Nation of Islam, the Nation of Islam has influenced a significant part of the way that the African American community understands Islam, not in total, but there is an influence there. But if you think about the Nation of Islam, the idea in the Nation of Islam was separation, to separate from the society. And when we think about the immigrant community, the idea was that we're not going to stay here, right? So there was always this lack of rootedness. And when we look at the knowledge base of the Muslim community in the US, the knowledge base has never really been a knowledge base in which facilitated the growth of the community. Like when we compare, for instance, to the Catholic Church, when priests were imported from overseas, there was this understanding of that we need to establish ourselves here, but then eventually there was this whole discussion within these institutions, uh, cultural institutions that were governed by the Catholic Church, because you had the Catholic churches were based on ethnicity. So you would have an Irish church, a German church, so on and so forth, an Italian church. The dialogue became, how do we address the society? And even the Catholic Church had difficulty with this, right? They had difficulty with how do we address the society, because the Catholic Church eventually was considered to be institution under suspicion because America itself, as far as the U.S. is concerned, was founded on Protestant Christian ethics or Protestant Christian understanding. For the most part, we know that there was diversity there. We know that this is not only a Christian country. We know the diversity of origins of the people that were here, the people that came here. We know that there were a good many different things that informed the society, but we're talking about what became dominant. What became dominant. So the issue of knowledge and rootedness is not only a problem that the Muslim community faces or has faced, other communities as well have faced this. But the reality of the Muslim community is that here in the US is that we don't put enough emphasis on knowledge. Knowledge is something that's secondary. So our sense of rootedness is not necessarily grounded in knowledge, right? And this was something uh, that was brought to the fore when the article "The Cultural Imperative" that was written by Dr. Umar Abdullah Farouk Hafidhullah, when he talked about the cultural imperative, the necessity to have a culture for American Muslims that is grounded in Islam and is also authentically American. You know, how do we reach that point? How do we reach that point of rootedness, of feeling that we're part of the society? You know, without knowledge, that's the question that's posed, or that's the question that the article will push us to think about. You know, if we are people that are concerned with how do you develop culture, you know, how do you do that and still keep your identity as Muslims, your value as Muslim, or your values as a Muslim. Uh, and those are different things, you know. You know, how do you construct an identity without just melting away? You know, how do you value yourself as a Muslim? You know what I'm saying? In a society in which you're trying to constantly figure out how to uh, interact with it if you don't have clear values that represent your Islam. You know, so all of those things are interlinked. So knowledge and rootedness is important. Identity has to come out of knowledge. Identity is something that is our reflecting upon ourselves and the decisions that we make as we engage in the society. Identity is not just if I have a beard or if I dress with this way or that way, because we see that Muslims manifest their cultural identity in a number of different ways when we look at the different uh, cultural dresses of the Muslim community throughout the Muslim world. You know, so identity can't just be focused on how we look and so on and so forth. It has to come back to the values of Islam, to the values of Islam, those things which are what are permanent, are long lasting, right? So the constructing of identity has a lot to do with having a sense of rootedness, of comfort with Islam, having a sense of feeling that yes, we can interact with the society, having a sense that we dialogue with the culture, not just that we're countercultural, right? And this has been the stance of the Catholics, and this has been the stance of the Muslims for such a long time, and this is the stance of some of the Christian communities. We find within the Protestant Christian community, they took the acculturation approach, where they began to adopt many of the practices of the community. So you have like Christian rap, you have like Christian R&B, and that necessarily didn't work. What happened was that the values of each community, the party community and the church community, began to collapse so that the two became confused. So there's a fine line between acculturation and maintaining your values or collapsing your values. There's a fine line between those two, maintaining your values and collapsing your values as you interact with the society. Because the forces of influence over human behavior are variegated, and one of the stronger forces is the media and popular culture. And the reality is that that's a realm in which the Muslim community is absent. We're not producing our books, we're not producing movies, we're not producing plays, things that the cultural products that the larger community understands. We don't have an identity and a voice there as of yet. So reflecting our values in the greater society becomes a problem, and that's where the idea of minority comes in. So we have to look at the life of the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam. We have to look at the values of Islam, and we have to look at ourselves and where we're at, and try to understand what is it that we need as a community, and dialogue with Islam. Dialogue with Islam, trying to understand what Islam is saying to us in the moment as communities, that we are going to be able to move forward. And so this is a dialogical process. We have to dialogue with the past and see how it is that the history of Islam has unfolded, to see where we're at, and to see how it is that we can chart a path forward in an authentic manner. But this will take from us to put a lot of focus on knowledge and to develop a long-term vision as to how to unfold and grow as a community. But without having people that are knowledgeable in our community about Islam, what we will begin to see is that people will begin to melt. Their identity will collapse because their identity will be based on superficial understandings of Islam, external understandings of Islam, and not principled understandings of Islam. Then the issue is not just understanding in an intellectual sense. The issue is also being able to practice Islam when the challenge uh, to abandon Islam is presented to us. Presented to us. So we have to be able to maintain our values and translate our values into action in a situation in which it's difficult to maintain. And that's the challenge in a society that is neoliberal, is that the carrier of values in a secular neoliberal society is the individual. If the individual can't uphold those values within himself or herself, then the individual will collapse because the culture in this society is more governed by the media and the popular feeling that which is within popular culture. In other institutions similar to the Muslim community, they uphold their values by engaging with the society at a number of different levels, having a space in media to reflect their identity, and having strong organizations to reflect their identity, and having literature and scholarship to reflect their identity, and having a space to practice it. We're still trying to understand what is the role of the masjid, and we have some insight into how to work with the other areas of life, but we're not at a point where we're thinking growth and self-preservation. We take this idea from the maqasid of the Sharia, the objectives of the Sharia. Each objective has two faces. One is preservation and growth. So one part of the community says growth and the other says preservation. No, we have to follow the way that the Sharia understands. The Sharia looks at life from two angles, from this perspective of preservation and this perspective of growth. So we have to look at identity from the perspective of values, that we have to preserve certain identities and grow by implementing them. Now, how do we implement them? That becomes the question. How do we grow? That becomes the question. And these are things that have to be studied, right? So first we ground ourselves by imbibing the values of the Quran and by looking at those characteristics that we have which go against the spirit of Islam, blameworthy traits, as Imam Ghazali uh, named them, among others, and see how many praiseworthy traits can we adopt. So we have to look at the life of the Prophet Muhammad and we have to study the Quran so that the Quran becomes a way of thinking for us. The Quran becomes that which informs our thinking. That way, we can begin to have a sense of educating ourselves. And then we have to be able to respect knowledge and the people of knowledge and develop institutions of knowledge and circles of knowledge, which will allow us to have these dialogical discussions that regard how do we live in the society, in these situations, in these moments, authentically as Muslims, as people that have values, in a manner in which we can contribute productively and grow. So we have to look to the future and build the future by looking to the past and seeing how we and understanding how we have developed, and understanding that each community that we see today has developed historically based on the certain historical realities, sometimes needs, and various situations that have shaped the way they are today. And then now we have to understand how knowledge will help us to transform ourselves and these institutions. And then how can we grow through knowledge beyond the issues of the past, beyond the current issues, so that we become more mature Muslims. So we see the Muslims that began to develop in Mecca. We see that the convert community came from different backgrounds, rich, poor, this country, that country, and so on and so forth. And then we see that they eventually grow to be a community that is grounded in the Quran and in the Sunnah when they reach the point of Medina. We see in Mecca it's a personal transformation, a communal transformation, but in Medina it's a communal maturation and a personal commitment to that community. الله أعلم أقول قولي هذا واستغفر لي ولكم والحمد لله رب العالمين